Économiste, UNICTAD, EITC, spécialiste dans le Continental Free Trade Area.
So I think we have a room small enough for me to speak without the microphone. I know we're behind schedule, so I'll keep it short, which was my plan in the first place. I have a presentation which is largely based on a research paper that we have conducted on the benefits and also challenges and adjustment costs of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or area. And I'll jump right into it. This is the one slide that has most text, the rest is mostly graphs and some numbers. The CFTA is embedded as a so-called flagship project of the African Agenda 2063, which is really, as you can see by the number 2063, a very long-term vision of the continent. And just like the UN Agenda 2030, it is an agenda that looks at sustainable development from all its angles and dimensions, both social, environmental, but also importantly economic. And it has the Continental Free Trade Area as a very fundamental pillar in it. And the motivation is probably a rather obvious one, and as President Kenyatta from Kenya has put it, there cannot be a reason or a good reason why it is easier for Africa, for us, to trade with Asia, Europe, or the Americas rather than with fellow Africans. Sorry. This is basically also, this can be corroborated by statistics. The share of intra-African trade in total African trade is only about 12%, whereas all other regions in the world have much higher shares of intra-regional trade. Europe more than 50%, North America 40%, Asia or ASEAN also in the around 50%. So that's why the key objective of the CFTA is to create a single continental market for goods and services, and also work on the movement of people, business persons in particular, and enabling investments inside the continent. And all this is, again, like the Agenda 2030, with the larger objective of what is called structural transformation, which essentially means that Africa should no longer be a sole provider of natural resources and primary commodities, but rather industrialize and build a manufacturing base. And also the CFTA is not explicitly but implicitly embedded in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in Goal 1711 in particular, that aims at increasing the exports of developing countries, and particularly least developed countries. And one question is, I mean, there's a lot of anti-trade or anti-globalization sentiment going around globally now. So why is this one a better trade agreement? And I think the straightforward answer is that this is a South-South agreement, among friends and partners, not one of those disputed North-South agreements that sometimes are accused of basically dividing the continent. The economic partnership agreements with individual countries, individual sub-regions on the continent with the EU or the US, that sometimes politically drive a wedge between African countries. So this is an agreement among friends that have natural commonality, natural geographic commonality, and every reason to collaborate more. So UNCTAD's contribution in this process is to be one of the formally acknowledged advisors to the African Union member states in a more analytical capacity, and we have done some work, and I'll present some figures later on. But first, what is the scope of this continental free trade area? It is a wide and deep agreement. It's not only a tariff liberalization agreement, but also one that goes much further, even beyond what is covered under the World Trade Organization in terms of topics. So you would look at the tariffs, of course, but also at what is referred to as non-tariff barriers, rules of origin, trade facilitation, and now, importantly, also infrastructure issues such as transit. You look at standards, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and its own dispute settlement mechanism. But also looking at trade and services in several sectors. And in a second phase, it would also look at competition policy, intellectual property rights, and investment facilitation. So it's a very wide agreement, and it goes into a depth that exceeds the WTO provisions in many cases. So I will start with something that brings it down to the basics, because even though this is a wide and deep agreement, most of the negotiations often tend to still focus on the tariff dimension, and this is what we assessed. We wrote a paper analyzing and simulating the potential gains from tariff liberalization within the continent. And we have looked at two different scenarios. One where all tariffs are completely eliminated, and one where we call it special SPC, special product categorization, where some products are exempted. The assumption here in the product exemptions would be that the countries exempt the sectors that is providing most tariff revenue, because this is a major concern for many of the African Union member states in the CFTA, that tariff revenue, which is a very fundamental income source in many government budgets, that this would this would be significantly reduced through the CFTA. So first of all, maybe I'll stand up for a second to show the graph. Focusing on the blue bars first. No, I think it's fine like this. The blue bars look at the full tariff liberalization, whereas these kind of gray bars include some product exemptions. And here you have the different prospective GDP growth rates that would come from the agreement. And here you have the number of countries that would fall into the respective categories. So for example, with full tariff liberalization, there would be, well, it's expected to be 3 countries that would make to GDP growth above or at 5%. And on the other extreme, you have some losers. This indicated here by this kind of obscure -0, should be a proper sign. So in the full tariff liberalization, there would still be 4 countries on the continent that would be actually experiencing a recession or decreased GDP growth through the CFTA. And a bunch of countries would be found in this 1 to 2% growth rate. What is interesting to observe if you compare the different scenarios is that actually by including product exemptions, the number of countries losing from the CFTA might actually increase. Why is that? The fear is that by excluding some of these sectors that are important for the LDCs, well, let's put it this way, if some of the more developed or middle income developing countries in Africa exclude sectors that are sensitive to them, that will actually hamper the prospective growth of the LDCs exporting to these other African markets. So there is definitely a risk if the wrong sectors are excluded, especially by the slightly more developed and the larger economies. The smaller developing and least developed countries may face basically an agreement which does not give them the growth prospects that are actually promised by it. Positive is that according to our simulations, the promise or the ambition of structural transformation is reflected in the simulations. So the largest growth rates would be in manufacturing sectors, followed by still positive growth rates in agricultural sectors and zero growth in the mining sector. So essentially what is hoped for in the CFTA that manufacturing sectors grow more is actually reflected in our simulations. Daniel?
So just quickly, is that for all of Africa?
This is an aggregate for all of Africa, yes. And then, still talking about the positives, the simulated growth rates in intra-African exports are in the 30% region, which would then be a very substantial contributing factor to SDG target 1711 to make especially LDC growth of exports increase significantly. And also the intra-African trade deficit, so it's not that's not the total trade deficit, it's the intra-African trade deficit. It would definitely decrease very substantially through the CFTA if all sectors are included. But of course there are the fears, and this is probably the most talked about issue in the negotiation process, is tariff revenue losses. In many countries, tariff revenue makes up 10 or even more % in total government budget, and some countries would experience a reduction of tariff revenue, total tariff revenue, by a quarter or even more, whereas most countries still experience between 5 and 10% reductions in tariff revenue. So this is a substantial drop, which is natural, which is basically what always happens in tariff liberalization and free trade agreements. But of course, this is very substantial if your government budgets depend so much on tariff revenue, which is different from other regions and developed countries where the tax base is on income, on consumption much more. But these kind of taxes in Africa, I mean, generalizing more than I should, but still on average, the tax base is less focused on income and consumption and more on tariff revenue. So this is a danger that needs to be addressed and considered. And then all of what I've said so far is long-term prospects. This is growth rates that would probably be attained in 5 or 10 or even 15, 20 years. But in the short term, there's an adjustment. And these adjustment costs are often ignored. Often the discussion focuses on just saying, oh, in the long term, everything will be good. But as Keynes has so nicely said, in the long run, we're all dead. So it has to be considered what happens in the short term. And unfortunately, this is very often forgotten, and it's also not discussed enough probably in the negotiation process. Because in the long-term benefits are always based on the assumption that workers will leave increasingly unproductive sectors and go to more productive sectors. But the first part means they leave a sector, which means they become unemployed. That's the truth to it. So if through liberalization, through increased competitiveness in particular, textile sector in one country becomes uncompetitive vis-à-vis larger and stronger industries in other African countries, this means unemployment for workers. And until an industry develops that is then more productive and then absorbs these unemployed workers, there is a way to go. This is not something that happens from one day to the other. And unfortunately, very often we as economists find ourselves ignoring these processes and thinking this will all happen automatically, but it doesn't. And I would like to highlight now that there are not only adjustment costs with regard to labor, but also with regard to capital. Machinery becomes obsolete and will have to be rebuilt. There has to be new investment into the newly, hopefully productive or more productive sectors. There has to be investments into training, bringing the right skills to workers in the sectors that are to be competitive. So it is absolutely crucial that after the assistance that UNCTAD provides in the negotiating process to find a good agreement, there's also continued practical assistance to countries to find these actual concrete flanking policies and not just talk about them in a general way. Because very often we find ourselves in this position where we say there have to be flanking policies that, as I wrote here, to ease the social impact of short-term costs, but we have to find country-specific strategies to deal with them that deal with realities of individual countries and individual sectors, and not let that be overshadowed in the positive sense by the long-term benefits. So I will make one more point, which is that this analysis has focused only on tariffs, and our other work program on non-tariff measures has assessed in several studies that the trade restrictiveness of non-tariff measures, and I would like to emphasize non-tariff measures includes both what is sometimes referred to as barriers, such as quotas, non-automatic licenses, and so on, but also technical regulations, standards, mandatory standards, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which cannot be eliminated because they serve much more important social and environmental objectives. But as a whole, this whole group has a tariff equivalent impact that is 2 to 3 times larger than tariffs, and the CFTA does address in the respective annexes and appendices these issues of non-tariff barriers, SPS and TBT measures. And according to our simulations, if these are properly addressed, the overall benefits of the CFTA could be increased by 3 to 4 times. And with what I've just said, I would like to then conclude, also in the interest of time, to reiterate that of course there is a very strong potential for growth in industrialization, including structural transformation from the CFTA, but not everyone gains equally, and not everyone gains. Some may gain very substantially, most gain, but there are some losers, and trade liberalization and globalization also not only leads to potential inequalities across countries, but also within countries. Based on the example that I brought, if a sector becomes uncompetitive through globalization or liberalization, this will bring people, or will drive people, some people at least, into unemployment. And until they find new jobs, hopefully better jobs, there's a way to go. And there's definitely a very strong need to actively address this and not just wait it out. And as I just said, there's a strong rationale, a strong motivation to look beyond tariffs and look into the area of non-tariff measures, and of course also trade facilitation, logistics, and all the other issues that are fortunately on the table in the CFTA. This was short, and maybe if there are more questions, we can discuss them. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. gain time. Okay, we got 5-10 minutes left before we need to move to the cafeteria, and you're all invited for the, well, invited, let's say, if you got your credit card, that we can all go for lunch together. Few questions about free trade, and multiple questions. I'll go for the ladies first. Ladies first.
No, well, if you could, okay. Thank you very much. I always appreciate your analytical work. Okay. And I wanted to ask you the following, because it's so interesting, but we need to read the paper, no? But aid for trade. If you mentioned in your joint paper, support programs such as aid for trade and infrastructure investment could be considered to help LDCs. What type of connection you have with the analytical work in WTO and other institutions? This is one question. The other one is about joining regional and global value chains in Africa. How will this contribute to that? I don't know if you want to.
I would rather respond directly because I didn't take a sheet of paper to remember the questions. So starting from the back in terms of regional and global value chains, the increased fragmentation of global production means that you can only actually participate if the trade costs between the partners in the value chain are low enough, because the gains within each step of the value chain become smaller. If you produce a large integrated product, you may have a larger profit margin as compared to being broken down in small steps. So the profit margins for each of the small steps actually become smaller. So you're only able to compete in a global value chain or regional value chain scenario if trade costs are low enough that don't cut into your small profit margins. So if the CFTA succeeds in bringing down trade costs, especially between African countries, of course, then there is a much better framework for African countries to join intra-African and develop intra-African value chains. And then, of course, if you have a local or like a sub-regional value chain, then these can much better fit into global value chains. You made reference to aid for trade, and in the paper we said that those countries, there are few but they exist, that might lose from the CFTA because their current industrial patterns would actually, just simply generally across many sectors lose competitiveness in the CFTA. That our analytical work helps to identify these countries, identify the sectors that are most affected in those countries, and then basically give that information to both the African Union and also all global aid for trade initiatives to particularly help these countries, rather than distributing aid for trade across all countries, especially also giving lots of aid for trade maybe to those countries that gain from the CFTA anyway, or substantially gain. It would make more sense to balance losers and winners by giving or addressing specific losing sectors and countries more and giving them particular and targeted aid for trade assistance.
Just a few comments. First of all, it would have been great if you and your team could have been participating in the WTO ILO joint project on trade and labor, because everything you said at the end makes plenty of sense, but it wasn't included sufficiently. But maybe in the future it might be possible.
Yeah.
I didn't see any mentioning made, or maybe I missed it, about CFTA and environment. If it's not included, it's a miss. Because what we heard from the previous speakers in terms of renewable energy, and that energy has to be provided for growth, if there will be some form of liberalizing this particular market, it would be useful for the whole region. But maybe I missed I missed something about it. But if it's excluded, it's unfortunate. I have a suggestion. I was participating in Jamaica last year about financing the SDGs. It was a UN organized event. And it was a similar problem in terms of most of the Caribbean countries are indebted. And their tax collection ability is very low for various reasons. So the question is, well, how to get money? And the previous speaker, of course, in that sense, it's interesting how to find through PPP or other means from financial development banks, means to finance the SDGs. But within the CFTA, you pinpointed that there will be losers. Is there any discussion as to some offset mechanisms? Like in the EU, we have the different means to bring on board the less developed countries who have similar problems, like in Africa at a different scale. Is there any discussion about, maybe even in Switzerland, it's my own country, you know, we have the well-off cantons meet with the less well-off cantons and make deals, not in terms of just handouts, but they have to come up with sensible projects that the well-off cantons finance, so as a means to alleviate the adjustment cost of the losers, and to not scare them too much, but actually to have a proactive plan, which could also be good in terms of regional togetherness, to see that everybody would, in that sense, be taken care of for a long-term perspective. So when they go down a bit together on your adjustment curve, but then also will bring up everybody, including the losers, as much as that's possible.
Thank you. So regarding the first point in terms of looking at also the collaboration with ILO, it's a point well taken, and I'll bring it to the respective focal point inside our organization who deals with labor issues. Secondly, regarding environment, the CFTA itself is an economic agenda. It's an economic pillar in the wider Agenda 2063, which also has environmental and social components. So in itself, the CFTA does not have a focus on the environment specifically. Those would be aspects covered in other, I would call them projects or initiatives inside this larger Agenda 2063. However, one thing that should be mentioned is that where trade touches national regulation and also environmental related regulation, this falls under the SPS, the sanitary and phytosanitary annexes, as well as the technical barrier to trade annexes, where all kinds of regulations that would protect the environment would be covered. And those annexes, appendices, give what we call the policy space and the right to regulate pro-environmental objectives as a priority, while still trying to minimize the impact on economic development, but still gives the freedoms to regulate environmental protection. So in a sense, the ideal of the CFTA would be that while in itself it does not address the environment, it does not constrain other initiatives that would protect the environment.
But does it include energy?
To see, in terms of the service sector, it includes the energy sector.
Not the energy services,
energy
but
services.
not the energy goods.
No. Well, energy goods, you mean petroleum and so on?
Yeah.
Well, that would probably then be covered in the trade in goods agreement. So in that sense, it is included, even though generally speaking, import restrictions on petroleum are usually low. So there's probably not much scope to lower already low barriers to trade in that regard.
Or linked to renewable energy goods.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they would all be covered. All products, goods would be covered under the trade and goods agreement, and in a sense, indiscriminately, just as much as any other product, but maybe without a specific focus on them. Yeah, that would
Maybe
be,
I just add a footnote.
Yeah.
But I think it is not really viable from an environment, protecting the environment point of view. Because what we are enforcing is a scenario, is step by step, you're going to get there. Right? Instead of recognizing we have modern technology and we have what you talked about. And so actually inclusion is not just about saying that we have an agreement about how to export and importing environmental goods. It's actually about a preferential, purposefully made preferential arrangement to allow this to flow, because we know that the technology does cost money, and relying on ODA, frankly, has not worked. Right? So I think, you know, in some ways this discussion leads to the need for innovation in terms of how do we actually draft and negotiate new type of free trade. Otherwise, we still business as usual.
Business as usual.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
The third
There was
point-
one last point.
the third point, yeah.
The
Sorry.
compensation mechanisms, they were touched upon in the negotiations, but as you can maybe imagine, as soon as a financial budgetary transfer was even vaguely touched upon, this was completely shut down by most of the members, especially those who would then be in the position to provide financial assistance. But several things are being discussed, including, and this is probably very still contentious in terms of whether this would be legal under WTO rules, to impose a small tax or duty on all intra-African trade, which would go into an overall African Union budget, which could then again flow back into what could be called wider aid for trade and also infrastructure assistance. So generally speaking, whether this kind of tax will exist or not, the compensation of the losers or trying to bring them up to speed would focus on these infrastructure programs and general assistance in the aid for trade context, but also within the budgets of the African Union, but not a financial transfer
Yeah,
per
I
se.
just want to say one little thing. We have here the presence of our friend from Diego, who brought this book. Are you taking one? Take two copies, one for you and one for Bonaparte. And I think this is very pertinent in this type of meetings. First of all, recommendations for CFTA negotiators, and also the human rights, considerations. No? So I think it's a very good idea, to.
Yeah, and
I don't know if you want to say something about it.
yeah, just I was actually thanks for raising it. And I think the effort of the office has been much in some of the points that you touched. Not trade overall, there are winners, but some lose, and most likely the ones losing are the ones already left behind in general. So this study, in partnership with the Economic Commission for Africa and the Sherbet Foundation, we try to look at some points in some specific areas where informal cross-border traders, agro-manufacturing, labor, where there could be some kind of losers, and how could these be addressed through sometimes minor tweaks in negotiations that could diverge and as mentioned, which could create incentives to address these vulnerabilities of certain groups, including the gendered impacts of trade. And so I just think the office has a little bit to play in the debate as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, another question there. No, you're not small. You think small, but you're not small.
I'll promise I'll be very brief. Well, since it's the first time I address the forum, just say thank you to Africa 21 for the invitation and for the quality of the persons that have exposed their ideas. In the line of what we are saying at this moment, is there any discussion on the special and differential treatment for these small, because actually the number of countries that are going to be adverse is important. So special and differential treatment related to perhaps longer periods of time, or technical assistance from other ones, besides having a pot of money to.
Yeah, one of the fundamental negotiating principles that were defined even before the actual negotiations started for the CFTA were that there should be special and differential treatment for LDCs, for landlocked developing countries and small island states, which of course, as a whole group, is more than half the continent probably. There are longer periods of phase-in for the more vulnerable economies, to call them by a kind of a common name, in terms of they have more time to liberalize certain sectors. Potentially, I don't think this is fully decided, potentially more long-term product exemptions as well. And of course, once again, kind of preferential access to these additional funds and infrastructure and aid for trade programs. So the principle of special and differential treatment is definitely there. Yeah.
We'll have time to